Within the history of the church, there are many important people who have left incredible legacy and reputation, incredible impact actually on the church, whether the impact is found in the teaching and doctrine of the church, or it might be found in the structure of the church. Even in the practice of the church, people have left their mark, especially between the time of Augustine and the start of the Reformation. There's one figure who is perhaps unsurpassed by any other in the history of the church, and that is Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was born around 1225, and he was born into a fairly modest family. Parents are Landulf and Theodora de Aquino, and his parents, like most, wanted him to have a good education, a solid education. And he started his educational endeavors at Monte Cassino. Now, his parents knew he would receive a solid education there, but they wanted more than just information in their son's head. They wanted moral teaching, and they knew it could be found there. So he spent some years at Monte Cassino learning. And then eventually in his teenage years, his educational pursuits took an interesting turn because he ended up at the University of Naples. Now, that sounds fairly uninteresting until you consider the fact that the University of Naples was actually the first secular school. It was the first school not tied to the church. And that really set up a lot of what would impact Thomas Aquinas' life throughout many of the rest of his years. Because at the University of Naples, he sat under the teaching and guidance of one called Albert the Great. And it was at the University of Naples, under Albert the Great, where Aquinas encountered the teaching and the works of Aristotle, the famous philosopher, perhaps certainly one of the most famous philosophers in the history of the Western civilization. While at the University of Naples, he invested his time in Aristotle mainly. Of course, he didn't just limit himself to Aristotle. He studied Augustine heavily. He studied the Church Fathers. And he certainly studied the Bible as well. In his studies, eventually he developed his own thoughts, his own systematic approach even to philosophy, certainly as a student of Aristotle. But he's not just well known for his philosophical system, he's also well known for his theology, his theological writings and contributions, which is one of the lasting effects that Aquinas has had, really, between philosophy and theology. Many people then and throughout the years, even today, find it difficult to see how philosophy and theology are not at odds with each other. But in fact, according to Aquinas, they're not. In a simplistic explanation, Aquinas sought to show how faith and reason are not opposed to each other, but in fact they go together quite well. And his teaching is primarily found in one of his main works called the Summa Theologica. Throughout Aquinas' years, throughout his life, he has provided many works, many contributions into philosophical and theological thought. And of course, the giant of all those contributions is the Summa Theologica. Within the Summa Theologica, you can find many topics. There are hardly any, it seems, that are left untouched by Aquinas. And essentially, it's composed in three parts. He starts out with theological questions and ruminations about God, and seeking to answer those questions. And he moves on to more metaphysical topic of ethics. After spending some time on that, he ends in the third part with Christology. Now, throughout all three of these parts, he is providing questions to form the basis of his teaching. So he starts the approach through questions instead of just simple writing, and he answers these questions and then answers objections as well after presenting the objections. So it's a very thorough, very, very large work, and just as Aristotle is one of the most important philosophers in the history of Western civilization, then Aquinas' work, Summa Theologica, is just one of the most important contributions to philosophical thought in Western civilization. He would go on to, of course, not just offer this main contribution of the Summa Theologica, but he would also write commentaries on the Bible and commentaries on other philosophical works. One interesting tidbit about Aquinas comes from his childhood, at least early on in his adult years. He wanted to enter into the Dominican order, and his parents were not just opposed to that, but they were apparently passionately opposed to that. So much so that they didn't just reason with him to try to convince him not to join, but in fact, they actually kidnapped him for several months to prevent him from going. However, that would not last. He would eventually end up joining the Dominican order. Well, Aquinas is such an important figure, and people of his day knew it then. They knew of his importance and that the contributions that he had made. So much so that the Second Council of Lyons, when it was called, he was called to the council to offer his contributions. However, he would not end up making it there when he was en route. He suddenly became ill and his health declined very quickly, and it wasn't too long after that, in 1274, that he passed away. So he never made it to the Second Council of Lyons, but his works did, and his works lived on, and many people have summarized his works and his thoughts and his systematic approach to philosophy and his theological contributions as well. There are certainly many to name, just a couple which I have resourced. Starts with The Thought of Thomas Aquinas by Brian Davies, which is a summary and an interaction with Aquinas' works. Next, along the same lines, is one by Gilson, The Christian Philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, which again is a summary and interaction, but it is primarily aimed at those who call themselves Thomists, or those who adhere to Thomism, the teachings and works of Thomas Aquinas himself. And just to prove that Aquinas' thoughts and contributions have had a lasting impact, this is just one small example, but the work of Curtis Chang called Engaging Unbelief. This is a book written about how to approach unbelievers, and within this, the author Chang provides the thoughts and arguments from Augustine, but also Aquinas, depending on him. And so there is a timelessness proven to be found within Aquinas and his thoughts.